After years of silence, a random voicemail exposed what my family really thinks of me. Some absences are louder than presence, the kind that lingers in the space after the phone doesn't ring on your birthday, or when your name disappears from group messages like it never belonged there in the first place. You try not to count those things, not because you're over it, but because you've trained yourself to stop keeping score in a game you were never meant to win. That was how it was with my family. Not broken in the explosive way people imagine when they hear the word estranged, but quieter, more corrosive. A slow erosion of self-worth done behind the polished front of shared dinners and polite holiday cards, behind phrases like, "You're being dramatic," and "just let it go." I didn't leave because of one fight. I didn't storm out or slam doors. I drifted, like something untethered, slipping away so slowly they barely noticed until I was gone, and even then, they treated my absence like it was a relief they didn't have to admit wanting. I moved cities, blocked numbers, built a new rhythm around people who didn't expect me to edit myself just to be loved. And I learned what peace felt like when it wasn't something earned with silence. But silence has its own kind of sound, and sometimes it breaks all by itself. The voicemail came on a Wednesday, a random midweek moment that should have been forgettable. I was sitting on the back porch, coffee cooling beside me, the sun rising slow and golden against the fence. The alert on my phone blinked softly. One missed call, no voicemail transcript available. I almost ignored it. I almost deleted it without listening, assuming it was spam, or worse, some automated recording pretending to be a real person. But something made me tap play. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe some part of me still tethered to a past that had never really stopped whispering my name behind closed doors. The voice that came through the speaker was unmistakable. My sister, and she wasn't talking to me. At first it was just background noise, music, laughter, glasses clinking, a gathering, maybe a dinner, maybe someone's birthday I hadn't been invited to for years. Her voice was muffled at first, then sharpened as she leaned in too close to her phone, unaware that it had dialed. God, I don't even miss them. Honestly, like I know we're supposed to pretend, but come on. Laughter. Another voice, my mother's, lower, controlled. That familiar, sweetly condescending tone I'd heard 1,000 times behind my back and in front of my face. They always wanted to be the victim. Every family has one, don't they? Always finding something to be upset about. A third voice chimed in. My brother. Probably after too much caffeine, because his filter was always the first to go. I mean, we gave them so much leeway, tiptoeing around everything, and still, it was never enough. It's like they wanted to be miserable. A pause. Then my sister again, sharp and tired. If they ever come crawling back, don't say I didn't warn you. I'm not doing this again. A beat. The call ended, but everything else began. I sat there motionless, for longer than I can remember. Not because I was surprised. No, that would have been too kind to my own expectations. But because some part of me had held on to hope that maybe I'd been wrong. That maybe the silence was circumstantial. That maybe the distance had been a misunderstanding no one had the language to bridge. That maybe the blame I carried for walking away was mine to carry because I had made them uncomfortable, not because they had wanted me gone. But the voicemail. It didn't just confirm the truth. It stripped it bare. There was no mask left, no pretense. Just voices, unaware, unfiltered, unforgivable. I played it again, not because I needed to hear it, but because part of me wanted to burn every last doubt, their laughter, their casual cruelty, the certainty in their voices that they were the injured party, that I was the burden, that my absence was a favor. I saved the voicemail, not out of vengeance, but as proof. Not for them. For me. For the rest of the day, I moved like a person underwater. Everything was slower. The world looked slightly askew, like someone had tilted the axis just enough to make gravity feel wrong. I made dinner, but didn't eat it. Turned on the TV, but didn't absorb a single word. The voicemail echoed in my ears like a loop, filling in every blank space I'd ever tried to paint over with healing. What they said didn't surprise me, but the ease of it did. The comfort they had in mocking me behind a phone that accidentally became a confession. The gall to act like my silence was a performance, not a survival mechanism. It made me wonder how long they'd been waiting to say it, or if they always had. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and weighed every option. Confront them? Send the voicemail back with a message of my own? Post it publicly? Burn it? Delete it? Pretend I never heard it? None of it felt right. None of it felt like closure. Because what closure do you get when people confirm that their love was always conditional? What peace can you possibly find when the ones who raised you didn't just fail to love you the way you needed, but resented you for needing it in the first place? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote them a letter. Not a confrontation, not an apology, just a truth. A truth I no longer needed them to validate. I didn't send it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But writing it was like stitching up a wound I hadn't realized was still open. You didn't break me, but you did bury parts of me so deep, I forgot they existed. I'm not angry that you talked about me. I'm angry that it took a mistake for me to hear how you really felt. And the worst part is, not a single word surprised me. That's the grief I carry. Not that you said it, but that it was already expected. You taught me how to survive without love. I'm learning how to live with it now. But not because of you. In spite of you. When I finished writing, I sat in silence. Real silence. Not the empty kind that waits for validation, but the kind that finally stops needing it. That voicemail didn't wound me. It freed me. I didn't need to call them. Didn't need to explain. Didn't need to keep the lines open for people who only reached across when they needed someone to blame for their own discomfort. They had spoken their truth, and I had listened. Now it was my turn. Not with words, but with distance, with peace, with the life they said I couldn't build without them. I hit archive on the voicemail, not delete, not yet, because some ghosts deserve to stay, not to haunt, but to remind you of everything you survive. There are moments when you can feel your life dividing, not in dramatic thunderclaps or declarations, but in the stillness that follows a truth you can't unhear. Since the voicemail, something in me had shifted, realigned in a way I couldn't quite name but felt in the movement of my limbs, in the silence of the apartment when I woke. I moved through the world differently now, not wounded, not vindicated, but aware. It was like someone had finally turned the light on in a room I'd spent years navigating in the dark, and I could now see every edge I'd bruised myself on. But instead of flinching from the memory of pain, I simply observed it. No more excuses. No more reaching backward. The echo of their voices had become the proof I never thought I'd get, and with it came a calm that was almost terrifying in its clarity. I didn't tell anyone about the voicemail at first. Not my friends, not the quiet handful of people I considered family by choice. It sat in my phone like a vial of poison I refused to swallow. I'd moved through years of justifying their absence to people who meant well but didn't understand. The "but they're your family" crowd. The "you only get one mother" chorus. The "you'll regret not making peace someday." What none of them grasped was that I wasn't estranged because I enjoyed the distance. I was estranged because the proximity came at the cost of my sanity. But now that cost was something I could measure. It had a timestamp, a duration, a series of voices layered over one another like a choir of polished cruelty. And still, I kept it to myself. Not because I was protecting them, but because I was still deciding what this truth meant for me. I went to work. I made dinner. I returned emails. On the surface, everything resumed. But internally, I was untangling years of self-doubt, peeling off each layer like it was a skin I no longer needed. The voicemail didn't tell me I was wrong. It told me I was right. And nothing is more destabilizing than realizing your survival wasn't a reaction. It was a necessity. It was about a week later that I ran into Camille. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Not out of animosity, but from the natural distance that life carves when healing and routine pull people in different directions. Camille had known me back when I was still trying to make it work with my family. She'd seen the phone calls that left me drained, the text messages that read like passive-aggressive riddles. She was the one who once said, "You're not imagining it. They gaslight you so smoothly it sounds like affection." I hadn't known how to respond to that at the time. But now, I understood exactly what she meant. She spotted me first. I was standing in line at a cafe, scrolling through emails. Her voice called my name like a bell, startled but warm, a tether to a version of myself that had only just begun to wake up when we last spoke. "Wow," she said, stepping into line beside me. "You look good, like lighter." I smiled, not knowing how to explain what had changed. Been doing some spring cleaning, inside and out. We sat down with our drinks, the conversation dancing through casual updates, jobs, apartments, new books. But the space between us hummed with something unspoken. She kept glancing at me like she was waiting for the real reason I looked so different. "You seem balanced," she finally said. "Like you've let go of something." I stirred my coffee. "Or someone." She tilted her head. "Family?" I nodded. Then I told her. Not everything, but enough. She didn't interrupt. She didn't pity. When I finished, she just sat there, eyes steady. "You knew all along," I said quietly. "Didn't you?" She sipped her tea. It wasn't my truth to say. But yeah, I knew. There was no judgment in her voice, only affirmation, the kind you feel down to your bones. "Do you want to send it to them?" she asked. I shook my head. What would it do? They already believe what they said. Hearing themselves say it won't change that. And I'm not going to fight for space in a room they locked me out of years ago. She exhaled. "That's strength, not bitterness. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something deeper, a release, the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that happens when grief has done its work and no longer needs to wear a name. That night I listened to the voicemail one last time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to mark the moment when it stopped hurting. It sounded different now, like a recording from a different life, like dialogue from a play I no longer had to perform in. I didn't delete it, but I renamed the file. I called it Closure. Then I backed it up once, twice, then shut off my phone. And the voicemail had become a relic by now. No longer a trigger, no longer a mystery, just a digital artifact of something I had already suspected but could never prove until that one slip of fate handed it to me raw, unedited, and undeniable. In a way, I owed it something. Not thanks exactly, but acknowledgement. That single accidental call had peeled the final layer off a wound I'd been nursing in secret for years. It gave form to a phantom I had spent my whole life arguing against. This intangible shadow of being too much for the people who claimed to love me. It showed me that the silence wasn't misunderstanding. It was rejection. And suddenly, it wasn't painful anymore. It was clarifying. What surprised me most wasn't that the pain was manageable now. It was that I no longer had the urge to explain myself. Not to them. Not to anyone. The compulsion to write long texts I'd never send, the temptation to craft the perfect clapback email, the inner monologue rehearsing what I'd say if they ever confronted me. It had all gone still. What was there to say when the evidence was right there in the background noise of a careless call? There was no misunderstanding left to clear up, no olive branch I needed to extend just to make peace with people who'd always seen my absence as an improvement. In the weeks that followed, I focused more on my work, quietly, steadily building a life that didn't need an audience. I reconnected with parts of myself I hadn't spoken to in years. Painting again, not for a client or a gallery, but just because. Cooking meals that took longer than 30 minutes. Reading books that didn't promise productivity or transformation. And in those slow hours, something beautiful happened. I stopped thinking about what they might think of me. There had always been a pull, however faint, a gravitational pressure tugging on the edges of my progress, whispering, "What if they're right?" But now that voice had been replaced. Not by a new one, but by quiet. The kind that lets you rest, the kind that makes room. It wasn't about forgiveness. I wasn't chasing that. I wasn't angry either. Not anymore. What I felt now was detachment. Not apathy, but distance with purpose. A steady, calm knowing that they had said what they meant when they thought I wasn't listening. And I believed them. But peace has its way of attracting ghosts, and mine arrived in the form of a wedding invitation. The envelope was cream-colored, thick stock, elegant. My cousin's name was written in soft gold calligraphy. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the last family gathering I'd left early and never returned to. She hadn't reached out since. None of them had. And yet, there it was, a single line near the bottom of the card. Family is forever. come home. I turned it over in my hands more times than I'd admit. Not because I was tempted to go, but because I was trying to decide what the message was really saying. Was it sincere? Or was it bait? Was it a test? A way for them to measure my distance against their performative gestures? I set the invitation on my desk. Left it there for a week. Every time I walked by, it became less of a question and more of a statement. I wasn't going. Not because I was punishing them, but because I didn't owe them my presence anymore. My healing didn't require performance. Their comfort was no longer my currency. Still, the invitation had stirred something. Not anger, but curiosity. I started wondering what they were telling people about me now. In my absence, I imagined they'd rewritten the script. Maybe I was troubled. Maybe I was private. Maybe I was the cautionary tale they invoked when younger relatives asked too many questions. Whatever the case, I wasn't there to contradict them. That was the risk you took when you left the table. You gave them your seat, and they'd fill it with whatever version of you they found most palatable. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to argue. It just is. And the people who matter will know. I shared the voicemail with Camille. Finally. Not for validation, but because I trusted her with it. We sat across from each other in my living room, her face unreadable as the recording played through my speaker. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and said only this: "They've been lying to themselves so long they thought the performance was reality." "And you walked out of the theater?" I nodded. "Yeah, and they kept acting like I was still sitting front row." We laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt good to laugh with someone who didn't need the whole history to know the heart of the story. Camille paused. "Have you ever thought about telling your side? Like, really telling it? What, like a memoir? Or an article, or something anonymous, just to put your version in the world? Doesn't have to be about revenge. Could just be your voice." The idea stayed with me long after she left. I didn't want vengeance, but there was something about reclaiming the narrative that felt necessary. Not to correct them, but to affirm myself, to speak without waiting to be invited, without lowering my tone or choosing softer words. That night, I opened a blank document, and I began, not with their names, not with the voicemail, but with a sentence I'd never allowed myself to write before. They told me I was too sensitive. What they meant was, I noticed everything they hoped I wouldn't. I didn't stop writing for hours, and when I finally slept, I dreamed not of confrontation or reconciliation, but of a quiet room filled with sunlight and pages. My own words, my own version. The morning after I submitted the piece, I stared at the email confirmation for nearly half an hour, my cursor blinking like a silent metronome, measuring the space between fear and relief. It had taken weeks to write. Long nights where words bled out like old wounds reopening, afternoons where I deleted entire paragraphs because they felt too much, or not enough. But it was out there now. Not as a weapon, not as a confession, but as a record. An offering to the universe from someone who no longer needed to be believed, to know she was telling the truth. I didn't name them, not out of mercy, but because I wanted the words to stretch beyond the specifics. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need their shame. I needed people like me to read it and recognize their own breath in the space between lines. The scapegoats, the peacekeepers, the ones who walked away from a table that never served them anything but silence and guilt. I wrote for them. I wrote for the version of me who stayed too long and apologized too often. I wrote for closure, yes, but not the kind they talk about in therapy. I wrote for the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that doesn't require someone else's acknowledgement to exist. I published it anonymously. The editors agreed to it without hesitation. But when the piece went live, it caught fire. People read it. People shared it. And more than that, people understood it. Hundreds of comments flooded in from strangers who sounded like they could have been my mirror. They recited lines from the story back to me in their messages, sometimes word for word, sometimes with their own family names swapped in. They talked about whispered betrayals, about siblings who turned into strangers, about parents who smiled in public but blamed them behind closed doors. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't dared hope for. Validation without compromise. Belief without having to earn it. A strange kind of community formed around the piece. Quiet, invisible, but unshakable. It was like we had all found each other in the dark, lighting our candles one by one. I hadn't expected it to reach them, but it did. 2 weeks after the piece went viral, I received a text from my sister. Saw what you wrote. Real mature. No greeting, no signature, no ownership. Just the same old tone, dripping with condescension, as if she still believed she held the moral high ground. I didn't reply. Then my brother, a few days later. Guess you're still stuck on the past. Some of us moved on. Again, I said nothing. Because I had moved on too. Just not in the direction they understood. What followed wasn't silence, but a slow unraveling of the wall they'd built around themselves. Family friends began to reach out. Not all, just a few. Quiet, private messages. Some said they were sorry. Some said they'd always suspected. A couple even asked if I was okay. I answered the ones that felt sincere. I left the others unread. Not out of cruelty, but because the door was closed now, and I was no longer in the habit of reaching through it for scraps. My parents didn't respond. That, too, was a response. And honestly, I preferred their absence to their pity. I didn't want them to read my words and feel bad. I didn't want them to see themselves in the story and weep. I wanted them to sit with it, quietly, uncomfortably. The way I had sat with years of their erasure, birthday phone calls that never came, holidays with empty chairs, conversations that turned cold the moment I asked for more than their convenience. I wanted them to hear themselves. In the silence I'd left behind, the voicemail stayed saved, still titled Closure, though now it felt less like an anchor and more like a page torn out of an old book I no longer needed to finish. I hadn't listened to it in months. I didn't need to anymore. Its work was done, and so was mine. Camille threw a dinner party a few weeks later. Just 6 of us, all people who knew something about rebuilding themselves from the inside out. She cooked something elaborate, like always, and insisted we all write one truth on a slip of paper and burn it before dessert. It was dramatic and beautiful, and exactly the kind of ritual we'd come to crave after spending years trying to perform normalcy in families that preferred we stayed muted. My truth was simple. I wrote, I don't miss them. I folded the paper slowly, felt its weight in my palm for a moment, then placed it in the shallow ceramic bowl Camille had set out. It caught fire instantly, curling into ash with a sound so soft it felt holy. I watched it burn, and I believed the words I'd written, because I didn't miss them. I missed the version of them I thought existed. I missed the idea of family, the illusion. But the reality? The voices in that voicemail? I didn't want them back, not even an apology. Because I was done being a home for people who only ever visited when they needed someone to blame. Later that night, Camille pulled me aside. The music had mellowed, the lights dimmed to that golden warmth that makes every truth easier to speak aloud. She handed me a glass of black coffee, tapped her fingers against the rim thoughtfully. You ever think about reaching out? Not to them, but to the people who didn't know? I tilted my head. Like who? Extended family. People who might have just taken their word for everything. People who still ask about you and don't know why you never come to family gathering. I let the question sit between us. I used to think I had to explain myself, I said. But now, I don't need to fix their version of me. I just need to live mine. She smiled. That sounds like peace. I nodded. It is. We didn't talk about the voicemail again. Not that night. Not the next. It had served its purpose. The damage was real, yes. But so was the clarity. They had spoken their truth. And now, I was finally living mine. No apology pending. No confrontation required. Just a future without the weight of their shadows. It had been 6 months since the voicemail. 6 long, reflective, deliberately quiet months. In that time, the piece I wrote had moved from front-page virality to quiet background hum, living in comment sections and repost threads where people still whispered about their own unnamed traumas like small sacred fires they were learning to tend instead of extinguish. I never revealed myself as the author. I didn't need to. Those who knew, knew, and those who didn't, it didn't matter. My voice was out in the world, Finally, authentically, without filter or apology. And in those 6 months, something inside me began to shift in a deeper, more rooted way than before. The kind of shift you don't notice until you realize it's already changed you. I wasn't walking through my days with a weight I couldn't name anymore. I wasn't writing text in my head I'd never send. I wasn't flinching when old photos popped up in the cloud or when someone mentioned family like it was a warm blanket instead of a bed of nails. I had become steady, not impenetrable, but sure. I spent more time outdoors. I traveled more, sometimes alone, sometimes with people who didn't ask me to be less for the sake of harmony. I laughed more loudly, cried more freely. I started painting again. Not the safe, gallery-ready kind I'd once trained myself into creating, but wild, messy, abstract explosions that didn't need to be anything but honest. My apartment changed too. Walls once sparse and cautious now bore vibrant canvases and photographs I loved, shelves lined with books I'd reread, furniture I actually found comfortable, not just stylish. My space had finally become a reflection of my life, curated not for approval, but for peace. The only thing that hadn't changed, really, was them. My family still didn't reach out, at least not in any real way. A few awkward likes from distant cousins on social media, a birthday message from an aunt that felt suspiciously coordinated, and once a vague comment under a post I made about my writing. Your voice is so powerful. Some people might find it hurtful, though, you know. No name, no profile photo that gave it away. But I knew. I always knew. And I didn't respond. Because they still didn't get it. The truth wasn't meant to comfort them. It wasn't even about them. It was about me. It was about being able to wake up each morning and not second-guess my reality. It was about walking into rooms, literal or digital, and not carrying their gaze on my shoulders like chains. It was about finding my voice where I had once been punished for raising it. And now that I had it, I wasn't giving it back for anything. Then, one day in late autumn, I got a letter. Not an email. Not a text. An actual physical letter. It came in a plain envelope, my name handwritten on the front in shaky slanted script. There was no return address, but I recognized the writing instantly. My mother's. I'd seen it on report cards she'd signed without looking, on holiday cards she sent without messages, on checks she used to write to Garrett when he needed just a little help getting back on his feet. I stood at the door for 10 minutes, envelope in hand, deciding whether or not to open it. I didn't feel dread, just hesitation, because I knew that opening it meant making a choice, whether to re-engage, to entertain the possibility of re-entry into a world I had finally escaped. But curiosity doesn't always ask for permission. Eventually, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it with a butter knife. There were only 3 sentences inside. I read your story. I see now what I never wanted to. I'm sorry I didn't believe you when I should have. No love, no signature, just that. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough either, because there was no, I'm sorry for what I said when I didn't know you were listening. No, I shouldn't have let them talk about you that way. No, I failed you, and I'm trying to make it right. Just an acknowledgement, a sliver of light. But no door opened, and maybe that was the door I had to close myself. I didn't respond, not immediately, not impulsively. Instead, I left the letter on the table and went outside. The sky was bruised with early evening clouds, the air crisp, the kind that carried the scent of firewood and cold metal. I walked without music, without distraction, just me and the sound of my breath, the echo of those 3 sentences bouncing around in my mind. I thought about how often I had begged, silently, unknowingly, for words like those. How many nights I had whispered versions of that apology to myself because I knew I'd never hear it. And now that I had it, in the smallest, most restrained form possible, I felt empty, not broken, just done. It wasn't anger. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else entirely. It was closure that didn't need ceremony. I returned home, folded the letter, and placed it in the same box that held the voicemail. Then I pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote my reply. I don't need you to believe me anymore. I don't need you to understand me either. I needed those things once. But I've built a life that no longer depends on your permission. I signed it with my full name, not your daughter, not with love, just me, whole, present, unapologetic. Then I tucked the letter away, not to send, but to remember who I had become when no one was watching. Camille called me a few nights later. She was sitting on her balcony, a glass of tea in hand, her voice soft with that kind of exhausted comfort that comes after a long day spent doing something meaningful. "I've been thinking," she said. "You know that story you wrote? The anonymous one?" "Yeah. You should put your name on it." I didn't answer right away. "I mean it," she continued. "You're not hiding anymore. You've done the work. That story changed people. You changed people." I looked around my living room, the paintings on the walls, the plants thriving in corners I once forgot to water, the soft hum of music I used to turn down in case someone else found it too much. "I'll think about it," I said, and I meant it. Because maybe one day I would. Maybe one day I'd claim that truth with every part of me. But even if I didn't, it was still mine, and they couldn't take it back. Not the words, not the silence, not the voice I had fought so long to reclaim. There was something different about the way mornings felt now. Not brighter, not more cinematic, just present. I didn't wake with that dread-guilt mocktail in my stomach anymore. Didn't start my day scrolling through texts I knew wouldn't be from them, or checking family group chats I was never added to in the first place. The quiet didn't sting like it used to. It had become mine, no longer a void, but a canvas. I filled it with new routines. No more emotional hangovers from dreams where we finally made peace. No more mental rehearsals for confrontations that never came. I didn't stop loving the idea of family. I just stopped loving the idea that it had to come from them. My phone buzzed one morning with a notification that the story, my story, was being picked up for a podcast discussion. They'd requested to interview the anonymous author. And that was the moment I realized I had to decide what the story really meant to me. Was it just a one-time purge? A scream into the digital void? Or was it more? A first stone laid in a path that could carry others who, like me, had been invisible in rooms they never belonged in. I sat with the request for hours, read it 3 times, then opened a blank document and started writing a reply. I told them yes, but with conditions. I wouldn't use my full name. Not yet. I'd use my initials. Speak with clarity but not vengeance, and focus not on the people who broke me, but the ones who didn't see it, and how we could make sure fewer stories ended that way. They agreed. The episode aired 3 weeks later. It wasn't viral, it wasn't explosive, but it was heard. And more than that, it was felt. Messages came in. People with similar stories, different names, different locations, but the same spine. Scapegoated children, exiled daughters, sons who carried the emotional weight of silence while their siblings wore golden crowns made of nothing but projection and praise. Some of them cried in their notes. Some just said, "Thank you." I thought it was just me, and it hit me then. Something I hadn't put words to until that moment. This wasn't about my family anymore. This was about the pattern. The insidious script so many of us were handed at birth. Be smaller. Be agreeable. Don't speak too loud. Don't need too much. Be the mirror, not the flame. And I was done reading that script. I wanted to burn it. Then, without warning, it came. A voice memo from my brother. I hadn't spoken to him since before the voicemail. Not a message, not a holiday reach-out. Nothing. He was always quieter than the rest of them, less cruel on the surface, more coward than manipulator. He preferred to let others swing the knife so long as he didn't have to clean the blood. So his voice, cracking through my phone like a ghost echoing through the static, made me freeze. I didn't play it at first. I let it sit in my notifications for an hour, then 3. Then finally, when the house was quiet and the sky outside had slipped into that navy blue twilight that makes everything feel suspended in time, I hit play. "Hey, I'm not sure why I'm doing this. I guess I just wanted to say that I heard the podcast, and I knew it was you." Silence. I wanted to be mad. At first I was. I told myself you were being dramatic, again. You know, like we always said. That was our line, right? You were always the one who felt too much, who took everything so personally. a bitter laugh. But then I listened to the whole thing, and I don't know. You didn't sound angry. You just sounded free. And I realized I don't know what that sounds like. I've never felt that. Another pause. I don't know what I'm asking for. I guess I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for not standing up for you, for saying things I thought were harmless, but I guess weren't, for being quiet when I should have said something. A longer silence. I won't expect a response. I just wanted to say that I see it now, what you were trying to tell us all those years, and I wish I had listened before someone else had to point it out for me. End of message. I stared at my phone. The message wasn't wrong, but it wasn't enough, because what he didn't say said more. He didn't say he regretted benefiting from my exile. He didn't say he'd change. He didn't ask how I'd survived it. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be the one to walk him through that answer. Not now. Maybe not ever. Still, it didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Because this is what healing really is, I realized. It's not standing in front of them and demanding they see you. It's walking so far ahead that their gaze no longer defines your shape. I archived the voice memo, not because I needed to keep it, but because I didn't want to carry it. Camille came over the next night. She brought her usual green tea and something green she swore was a salad but looked more like lawn clippings. We sat on the couch, legs tangled in blankets, an old movie playing in the background. When I told her about the voice memo, she didn't react with shock, just a slow, quiet exhale. "You gonna call him back?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." She nodded. "That's fair." And it was. Because just like that voicemail months ago, his apology wasn't meant for me. It was meant for his guilt. And I had no interest in becoming someone else's redemption arc. It was strange, walking through a life that no longer orbited them. It felt like space. Actual, breathing space. I wrote more, traveled, said yes to things I used to shrink away from. I let people see me, the full, complicated, scarred version. I didn't hide behind humor anymore. I didn't downplay my grief. I started to understand that boundaries weren't about keeping people out. They were about keeping me in, holding my shape, honoring my voice. One night, while watching the city lights flicker below my balcony, I realized I hadn't thought about the voicemail in over a month. It hadn't haunted me. It hadn't hijacked my day. It had simply faded. Not forgotten, but unimportant. That's what healing does when you stop asking for permission. It reclaims space. It rewrites silence. It stops needing an audience to be real. I didn't know if they'd ever reach out again. And I didn't care. Because the story was never about them. It was about me. And I didn't know that the final chapter of this story wouldn't arrive with a bang or a confrontation or a sobbing phone call begging for forgiveness. I'd expected it, if I'm honest. Part of me had always imagined that closure would wear dramatic colors, that it would sound like shaking voices or teary confessions, maybe even a letter written in some final act of acknowledgement. I thought endings came with punctuation, something firm, something resolute. I didn't expect it to come as softly as a breeze slipping through the cracks of a sealed room. I didn't know closure could feel like stillness. It had been nearly a year since the voicemail, 11 months since I first heard my family's unfiltered truth spoken in accidental whispers, 7 since I released that truth into the world disguised as a story, but more accurately, as a reckoning. And in that time, the woman I was had shifted so entirely that I sometimes forgot how badly I used to hurt. It wasn't that I no longer carried the scar, it was that I had stopped pressing into it to prove it was real. I had begun to live, not just function, not just survive, but live. The podcast interview led to an unexpected column. Nothing high profile, nothing headline-seeking, just a monthly space in a modest publication where I got to explore the strange, tender terrain of rebuilding yourself after emotional exile. People read it. People responded. They wrote back with stories so eerily similar it felt like they were pulling pages out of my own journal. Women in their 40s who'd walked away from sisters who never saw them. Men in their 60s who still hadn't figured out how to tell their mothers they were never coming back for the holidays. Teenagers writing from bedrooms they wanted to escape, asking if it got better. I never gave them platitudes. I didn't tell them it got easier. I told them the truth. It gets quieter. And then you begin to hear your own voice again. And one day, you won't need theirs at all. It was a rainy Sunday when I found myself back in my childhood neighborhood. Not by plan, just an aimless drive that turned into an accidental pilgrimage. I hadn't meant to come near the old house, but there it was, sloping and wide, its shutters still the same shade of pale blue, the lawn a little less pristine than I remembered. It looked smaller than I remembered. All the places we assign power to shrink eventually. Sometimes they shrink with time. Sometimes they shrink when you've grown too much to fit inside them. I didn't stop the car. I didn't need to walk up the driveway or stare at the mailbox or wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently. Because I already knew. If things had gone differently, I wouldn't be me. And I finally liked the person I'd become, even if they never did. 2 weeks later, I received a box. No return address, no note. Just my name written on the top in careful block letters. Inside, photos, dozens of them. Old family pictures, some I hadn't seen since I was a child. Birthday parties, vacations. Random weekends spent doing nothing. My face was in almost all of them, but never centered. Always off to the side, eyes cautious, smiling, but not freely, watching. At the bottom, beneath the photographs, there was a single piece of paper, typed. "We've gone through old things. We figured you might want these. No pressure. Just something from before everything went sideways. Maybe someday it won't hurt to look at them. Mom." There was no apology, but this wasn't an act of cruelty. It felt more like an act of surrender, of acknowledgement that we would never go back, and that the closest thing to a bridge between us now was the memory of a time when here's your story with all the asterisks removed. It hadn't yet been destroyed. I didn't cry. I looked at the pictures. Some made me ache. Some made me laugh. One made me close the lid of the box and leave it untouched for a week. But eventually I went back. I sorted them. Some I kept, some I threw away. Some I scanned and added to a digital archive, labeled not broken, just misremembered. Because that's what this entire journey had been. Not about proving that I was good or worthy or strong, but about correcting the story, reclaiming the memory of myself, rewriting the version of me that had only ever existed in the margins of their narrative. The last thing I did, the last act that signaled the true end, was delete the voicemail. I'd left it there for nearly a year, saved, archived, protected, a talisman of pain, a monument to my sanity. But that morning, something had shifted. It didn't make me flinch anymore. It didn't make me feel anything at all. It was just a file, a relic from a world I no longer lived in. I hovered my finger over the screen for a few seconds, then tapped delete. Just like that, it was gone, and the silence it left behind didn't hurt. It felt clean. Like an eraser across a chalkboard, I was finally ready to write something new on. Now, when people ask me about my family, I don't lie. I say it plainly. We're not close. And if they ask why, I don't apologize. I say, because some people love the version of you that keeps them comfortable, and when you stop performing that version, they stop loving you. And that's not family. That's theater. They nod. Some understand, some don't. But I don't bend myself into translation anymore. I let the truth sit where it belongs, untangled, unashamed. Camille and I hosted a small dinner that winter. Close friends, warm light, no expectations. We went around the table and toasted to one thing we were grateful to have let go of. People said relationships, regrets, dead dreams. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, glass in hand, voice steady. I let go of needing people to understand why I had to leave. That was it. No explanation, no epilogue, just truth. The real kind. The kind that sits quietly in your bones and says, "You're safe now." I never returned to that voicemail, because I didn't need it. I never confronted them, because I didn't owe it. I didn't forgive them because it was expected. I forgave myself for staying so long, for doubting what I knew in my gut, for trying so hard to be loved by people who only loved versions. And now, Now I wake up, look in the mirror, and recognize the face staring back. Not someone broken, not someone bitter, but someone who survived, someone who rebuilt, someone who never needed their voice to know her own. The story didn't end with them, it ended with me.